Chapter 1: What is worth teaching? In our country, we do not normally think of curriculum as a problem, in the sense that it involves imperfect choices and decisions made on the basis of defensible and therefore challengeable perceptions. We have an educational culture that is firmly entrenched into the rock of received knowledge. In such a culture, nobody asks why a certain body of information happens to be equated with education. Under our very different climate and historical circumstance, the influential American curriculum theorist Tyler would have been happy to find such a large number of people who are used to accepting the validity of one particular structuring of educational knowledge. Another thing that would have made him happier in India than in his own country is the ease with which disassociation between curriculum and the child's immediate socio-cultural and physical milieu is accepted, and the zeal with which principles for curriculum designing, teacher training, and so on are demanded and applied. My concern is not with the principles, but rather with the problem of curriculum. Inherent in this declaration is the assumption that there are no principles for developing a curriculum. In the dialogue on education, my agenda is to dispel the notion that there are certain time-honored, proven rules capable of guiding us when we want to prepare a curriculum for children's education. The position I wish to support is the opposite one, that there is no escape from reflecting on the conditions prevalent in our society and culture if we want to give a worthwhile education to our children. The problem of curriculum is related to our perception of what kind of society and people we are, and to our vision of the kind of society we want to be. By taking shelter in the received knowledge perspective and the principles of curriculum development that it offers, we merely shun our responsibility and allow ourselves to be governed by choices made long ago or elsewhere under very different circumstances. The problems of curriculum are related to the first of these three key questions to which most of educational research and reflection is addressed. What is worth teaching? How should it be taught? How are the opportunities for education distributed? Although the three questions are independent and can be pursued by themselves, they are related to each other at a deeper level. Until we arrive at that level in this present inquiry, we can pursue the first question, what is worth teaching, by itself. Whatever we can determine to be worthy of being taught is the proper candidate for inclusion in the curriculum. The obvious issue here is how to determine worth. What kind of value can we put upon different types of knowledge to distinguish between worthy and unworthy as regards their candidacy for becoming material for educational transaction? We can distinguish between two routes to solving the problem. The first route consists of deciding the worth of what we want to teach in view of the learner. The second consists of determining worth in terms of the intrinsic value of what we want to teach. I intend to chalk out both these routes and then to decide how satisfactory or otherwise they might prove in solving the problem of curriculum as I have defined. Route 1: Learner's viewpoint. It makes immediate sense to assess the worth of something we are about to give by taking into account the receiver's viewpoint. Education is something that adults want to give to children. So what could be better than judging the worth of what we want to teach in terms of children's own perception of it? The analogy of gift is obvious. When we are about to give a gift, we often choose it by considering the receiver's personality, likes, and needs. Attractive though the analogy is, applying it to education has obvious difficulties. One arises out of the fact that education is not for just one child. Hundreds, in fact millions of children may be involved. So we will not get very far by considering the likes and needs of each child. Most likely, we will have to be content with a generalized understanding of children's personalities. The second difficulty in applying the gift metaphor to education arises from the very nature of the knowledge that we as adults might possess about children. As adults, we may be able to think, to some extent, on behalf of children. But we cannot totally submerge ourselves in the child's point of view. I may be charged with mystifying childhood, but I feel it is important to remember that the ability to look at things from the child's viewpoint is a special kind of ability. There is evidence to say that for adults to have this ability may require a cultural context. In the West, such a context was created by the availability of Rousseau's reflections on individuality and freedom when industrialization increased the need for childcare and the possibility of child survival and health. The point is that although it is appropriate to determine the worth of what we want to teach in terms of the child's perspective, it may be extraordinarily difficult for us adults to take that perspective in the matter we are considering. Three reasons for this difficulty may be distinguished. First, children are interested in all kinds of things or can develop interest in just about any form of knowledge depending on how it is presented to them. So, what is worth teaching and what is not are not particularly relevant questions from children's point of view. Second, children cannot be expected to articulate their view of the worth of something as abstract as knowledge. But simply, as Donaldson does, the young child is not capable of deciding for himself what he should learn. He is quite simply too ignorant. At best, what children can be normally expected to articulate is liking or preference. And this brings us to the third reason, namely the likings expressed by children keep changing as they grow older. Therefore, it cannot provide us with a reliable basis for making sustainable decisions about what we should teach them. Going by the first route then, our best chances lie in agreeing to think on behalf of children rather than in trying to find out what they think. Now, if we agree on this more modest possibility, we can soon identify one basic sense in which worth can be determined. It is worth teaching something only if it can be learned. I'm referring to worth in the sense of being worthy of the bother of teaching. This is admittedly a rather pedestrian sense of worth, but nevertheless a useful one, for it can protect us from putting in a lot of wasted effort of which we can find numerous examples today. The mismatch between what modern child psychology tells us about how children learn on the one hand and the expectations embedded in school curricula on the other is so sharp and violent in our country that it seems an exercise in redundancy to identify little examples. Indeed, the danger of giving single examples is that people in charge of curriculum planning might respond by acknowledging these as lapses and remove them, leaving the edifice of an unlearnable curriculum intact. The example I will discuss here belongs to the early phase of school learning, when the distinction between knowledge and skill is a hard one to make. Learning basic skills such as reading involves the translation of several discrete kinds of knowledge of the world, people, and language to construct a highly dynamic system of decoding graphic signs. Recent research in the pedagogy of reading tells us that the success of reading instruction depends on the encouragement given to children to use their prior knowledge of language in its oral form and the world to decode printed texts meaningfully. In the light of this research, the alphabet-centered instruction given in Indian primary schools and the lack of incentives for children to use their hypothesis-forming ability discourage children's search for meaning. Repeated failure to make sense of what they are reading damages the self-concept of many children, leading them to drop out of school. Of others who do learn to read, many become mechanical readers in the sense that they can scan a printed page but cannot associate the text with their own experiences. We will return to this problem in the fourth chapter. Here it should suffice to say that if reading were taught in a manner in which it could be effectively learnt, the enormous wastage characteristic of our primary education would be less. At present, only the exceptionally persistent or motivated children are able to relate to the text, that is, to read in a meaningful way. Psychology and pedagogy thus can help us organize and teach knowledge and skills in effective ways. This is a significant contribution towards solving the problem of curriculum, but one that can be appreciated only after a decision has been made about the kinds of things that are worth teaching in the first place. In other words, psychology or pedagogy cannot tell us what to teach, only when and how. Psychology can tell us even less about the validity of combining different kinds of knowledge under one school subject. The choice of knowledge and the manner of structuring it have to be determined on some other grounds. If we wanted to decide whether it would be a good idea to introduce folklore as a compulsory school subject at the primary stage, no amount of psychological or pedagogical knowledge would help us take this decision. The decision has to do with our perception of the place of folklore in our socio-cultural milieu. It requires reflection on our cultural choices, the socio-economic underpinnings of these choices, and the implications of the choice of folklore as a school subject for all children. But once a decision to teach folklore has been taken, we can refer to child psychology and pedagogy to determine how to break up folklore into learnable and enjoyable sequences and what kind of teaching would most suit this new subject. Route 2. The value of knowledge. Let us turn to the second route, which consists of examining the worth of what we want to teach in terms of its intrinsic value. The word intrinsic is difficult to interpret and it can land us in trouble if we are not careful. So far, we have examined route 1, which involved ascertaining the worth of knowledge from the child's perspective. Our brief inquiry revealed that this route presents enormous difficulties beyond a particular point. The point at which one can separate knowledge that cannot be learnt. Beyond this, route 1 has little help to offer. Route 2 differs from this inquiry in that it does not refer to the child. What we are after is the possibility of identifying something intrinsically valuable in the knowledge we want to impart. Something that would qualify it to be in the curriculum under the only condition that it is learnable. That is, the condition that Route 1 has taught us to respect for its usefulness. On the face of it, the kind of inquiry we are making looks like the inquiry philosophers are known to make by asking, what is true knowledge? What they want to know in that question is, what is real knowledge as opposed to spurious knowledge? Supposing a philosopher could answer this question, would it be of use to us as teachers of children? Again, in rather too obvious a sense, one would say yes. If someone could convincingly distinguish true from false knowledge, surely no one would like to teach false knowledge. The problem arises when we recognize that unlike philosophical inquiry, education is a mundane business. Whereas philosophy is supposedly concerned with the pursuit of truth or true knowledge, education is mostly concerned with people, particularly people as parents, their aspirations, collectively expressed by the institutions they support, and with the social reality that shapes these aspirations. Education deals with knowledge in a rather limited context, which is defined by the social reality of a particular period or locale. Mannheim, I believe, was right in pointing out that the aims of education could only be grasped historically simply because they were shaped by history and therefore change from one period and society to the next. Despite its interest in truth, education deals not so much with true knowledge, even if such a thing could be ascertained and acknowledged, as with how knowledge is perceived in a given social milieu. Howsoever much teachers, many of whom may be inspired by ideals of one kind or the other, may want to train children to distinguish truth from falsehood, they can only do so within the context of what has been perceived and installed in the curricula as worthwhile knowledge. Crudely speaking, they are in schools to teach what counts as knowledge. And what counts as knowledge is a reconstruction based on selection under given social circumstances. Out of the total body of knowledge available to human beings, not all is ever treated as worthy of being passed on to the next generation. The rest waits in appropriate archives for either oblivion or resurrection under changed circumstances. This is, of course, a generalization, for we know that society is hardly a unitary system in the matter we are dealing with. At some point, we will have to treat this matter more carefully and examine how the composition of society and the corresponding composition of the structure of educational opportunities affects the choices of what is taught in schools. For the time being, however, the generalization that school knowledge is a reconstruction involving selection of knowledge should suffice for us. It can help us recognize the wide-ranging interaction involved in the process of reconstruction of knowledge. The interaction involves creation, codification, distribution, and reception, and it takes place under the shaping influence of economy, politics, and culture. What knowledge becomes available in schools for distribution has to do with the overall classification of knowledge and power in society. Schools supply individuals whose knowledge and skills are appropriate for the tasks generated by the economy and supported by politics and culture. Schools are able to supply such individuals with the help of appropriate reconstructions of knowledge. The star warrior delineated by Broad is not a product of fortuitous circumstances. He is an unmistakable product of America's contemporary politics, economy, and culture, as was the member of the Indian civil service in the early 20th century, a product of colonial India. The role of the American and the Indian educational systems in producing these archetypes is fully examinable in terms of the reconstructions of knowledge that the two systems are based on. Operating under the influence of economy, politics, and culture, the system of education sullies knowledge with associations of various kinds. Each association is like a watermark. It cannot be rubbed off, for the agencies that leave the mark are more powerful than, indeed beyond the control of education. By studying educational systems in the context of social and economic history, we can find several examples of such associations. Let me examine two of them. The first one relating to science India's exposure to the West under colonial rule contextualized science within the dynamics of colonization. Due to its association with colonization by a Western society, science became the target of xenophobia in many quarters of the anti colonial consciousness and struggle. Apathy to science, or worse still, suspicion of science and hostility towards it, grew as part of nationalist consciousness. Baran cites the opposite case of Japan. It's being spared the mass invasion of Western fortune hunters, soldiers, sailors, and civilizers saved it also from the extremes of xenophobia, which so markedly retarded the spread of Western science in other countries of Asia. To gain entry into the Indian school curriculum, science had to make a hard struggle, and even though it now has a secure place, it covers only a narrow spectrum of the activities permitted in the school. Basically, the culture of Indian schools remains hostile to science. If, for the sake of brevity, I describe the culture of science as that of touching, manipulating, personally observing, and making sense, then the culture of our schools could well be described as promoting the reverse by counterposing all these. Fear of science and all that it stands for continues to be embedded in our school culture and curriculum. Why it is not openly expressed is a different matter. Gandhi's approval for basic education offers another example of the influence of the sociology of knowledge on the school curriculum. An important aspect of his proposal was the introduction of local crafts and productive skills in the school. In functional terms, the idea was to relate the school to the processes of production in the local milieu with the declared aim of making the school itself a productive institution. Gandhi thought that the elementary school could not possibly get very far in a poor society if it did not produce a substantial part of its own needs. But apart from this functional aspect, the practicality of which has been debated, the proposal for basic education also had a symbolic aspect to which considerably less attention has been given. Symbolically, by proposing to introduce local crafts and production related skills and knowledge in the school, Gandhi was proposing the allocation of a substantive place in the school curriculum to systems of knowledge developed by and associated with oppressed groups of Indian society, namely artisans, peasants, and cleaners. It was no less than a proposal for a revolution in the sociology of school knowledge. For centuries, the curriculum had confined itself to the knowledge associated with the dominant castes. Basic education was proposing a subtle plan to carve room for the knowledge associated with the lower castes, including the lowest. In a truly basic school, children were expected to clean toilets. Effective implementation of basic education would have seriously disturbed the prevailing hierarchy of the different monopolies of knowledge in our caste-based society. In truly functioning basic schools, and they would have been common schools, the cultural capital of the upper castes would not have carried the stamp of total validity as appropriate school knowledge. The association between certain forms of knowledge and certain social groups is of importance to education because it characterizes the very image of the educated person prevalent in a society in one particular phase of its history. In every age, the educated man is defined differently, according to the associations that areas of knowledge and corresponding areas of ignorance have with different social groups. Dominance and distribution of the power to define roles play a significant part in determining the attributes which the educated person will be expected to possess. Thus, the problem of determining the worth of a form of knowledge to a certain extent arises out of the distribution of knowledge in society. The distribution of knowledge at a particular point of time may itself be an indicator of the distribution of the opportunities to be educated in that period. For someone who wants to make a curriculum, the question is, out of the prevailing forms of knowledge, which ones will I choose? It is this latter question that we have been pursuing along Route 2, and we have found that the educational worth of a certain form of knowledge cannot be determined according to some purely intrinsic characteristics of the knowledge in question. We have seen how important a role symbolic associations play in shaping the perception of knowledge in society. Need and character of deliberation. On the basis of this inquiry along the two routes, I wish to argue that the problem of curriculum cannot be dealt with as an act of social engineering. It is an act of deliberation. In a society like ours, where material capital and the cultural capital associated with education are so unequally distributed, curricular deliberation cannot escape conflict. How shall this conflict be resolved? Any deliberation is based on the assumption that no voice will be wiped out. Were it possible to wipe out a voice, the problem of finding room for it in education would not arise. Indeed, the contrary is more important. That in a polity where no voice can be expressly wiped out, education can offer a useful means to phase out certain voices or to make them inaudible. Dominant groups may use education, more specifically the curriculum, to see to it that voices other than their own are represented so inadequately, feebly, or distortedly that they develop a negative appeal and gradually lend themselves to be phased out as candidates for room in curricular deliberation. None of this needs to be a conscious process. It may actually be a quiet, civilized dynamic of dominance. Agreeing to perceive curriculum as an act and product of deliberation rather than a given rational construct is by itself a good preparation for innervating the dynamic. The failure of education to reach the oppressed groups in our society is directly related to this dynamic. It is easy to lay the blame for this failure on poor motivation among the backward and on administrative inefficiency. But the failure also offers us evidence of the inadequacy and narrowness of curriculum deliberation in our society. Curriculum deliberation is a social dialogue. The wider its reach, the stronger its grasp of the social conditions in which education is to function. The only way to expand the reach of curriculum deliberation is to include teachers in it, and this is where the problem of curriculum encounters its greatest challenge in the culture of education in India. In this culture, the teacher is a subordinate officer. He is not expected to have a voice, only expertise. What little curriculum deliberation does take place in the higher circles of educational power remains extremely poor due to the absence of the teacher's voice. But this is not a plea merely for the involvement of greater number of people in curriculum deliberation. Numbers matter, but more important is the capacity of a deliberation to be sensitive to the dialogues going on in the wider society. Judging the differential importance of specific dialogues and determining the stance education ought to take towards a dialogue are difficult tasks, but shunning them would mean permitting the curriculum to remain aloof from the concerns of the wider society. This is the situation we are in and have been in for a long time. Issues that our society is grappling with find no reflection or trace in the school's daily curriculum. The knowledge imparted in the classroom transcends all living concerns that children as members of the society might have, as well as all other concerns that the adult members of society have and which will affect children. This kind of transcendental curriculum is not just wasteful, for it does not use the opportunity the school provides for imparting useful knowledge, it is destructive too, for it promotes a kind of schizophrenia. The educated man produced by a transcendental curriculum sees and seeks to establish no relation between his education and his personal life and conduct. Modern pedagogical planning, particularly since independence, has attempted to bypass rather than remedy the dissociation between our schools and our society. The name of the bypass was psychologism, which consists of the claim that the broad principles of children's psychology are adequate basis for developing suitable curricula and materials. We have seen earlier that psychology can at best provide a limited answer to the problem of curriculum. But one school of psychologism needs to be examined in special, for it has virtually ruled the minds of many of our avowedly modern and scientifically oriented institutions of pedagogical research and planning, particularly since the 60s. The school I'm referring to is that of behavioral objectives of education schematized in a taxonomy by Bloom. Followers of this school argue that the objectives of curriculum and teaching need only be defined in behavior terms such as analyzing, translating, or inferring. What knowledge content is used to achieve these behavioral aims is immaterial. The idea is to allow the child to develop skills that can be used in relation to any context or situation. This view of curriculum is often called the process model, for it emphasizes the process of learning more than the content. That is, how something is learned rather than what is learned. Clearly, the model denies the problem we've been discussing, namely the problem of identifying worthwhile knowledge in relation to the milieu, particularly the socio-cultural milieu of the child. It promises a technical means to transcend the milieu, and it legitimizes such transcendence in the name of effective instruction. The model had obvious appeal for Indian educationists who had been accustomed since the beginning of colonial policies in education to seeing the socio-cultural milieu as an obstruction rather than an asset for education. The behavioral model came here during the 60s, the so-called development decade, when Indian planners were eagerly looking towards the West, particularly towards America, to find technical solutions to all kinds of problems. The promise of the behavioral brand of psychologism is a deceptive one, as Daniels has already shown, and I will elaborate on Daniels's critique. The fault lies in ignoring the nature of action concepts. Actions or behaviors, example obeying, analyzing, etc., do not have a one-to-one relationship with certain acts. One act of obeying may be altogether different in its motivation, aim, and implications from another act of obeying, depending on the circumstances under which the act has to be performed. Many different kinds of acts or behaviors can be accommodated under the label obeying or analyzing, and these same acts can be classified under other action concepts. This is how labels like loyalty, discipline, and service came so handy to educational planners of Hitler's Germany. By merely using behavioral labels to characterize the intended curriculum, we do not solve the basic problem of curriculum formulation, but evade it at an enormous risk of distortion of the aims of education that we may have in mind. Only by examining the intentions of the learner, the conditions under which learning has to occur, and the means or conventions of teaching to be used, can we ascertain what precisely will happen. This is how the problem of curriculum is related to the distribution of educational opportunities and to methods of teaching. The distribution of opportunities for learning in a society is an important factor, influencing both how worth of a certain kind of knowledge is perceived or weighed and how knowledge that is regarded as worthy of being taught will be represented in educational materials. We can take for granted that the knowledge produced and possessed by groups whose access to education is poor will not be regarded as worthy of being taught in schools. How the method of teaching affects the character of what is taught can be seen in science. The distinctness of science as a school subject comes from the need for experimentation by the learner. Of course, it is possible to teach science without experimentation, but then it loses its distinctness. If distinctness is a criterion for considering an area of knowledge as a separate subject at school, then there is no point in teaching science as, say, literature. As a subject that demands experimentation and independent inquiry by the learner, science is associated with freedom of judgment and equality between the student and the teacher in the presence of objective facts. Science education is supposed to be conducive to secular values precisely because it makes ascribed authority redundant. But if science is taught in a traditional manner with the authority of the textbook and the teacher's word and without opportunity for experimentation, it would cease to have a secular character and value. Once it loses its original character, owing to the application of conventional pedagogies, science can well become an instrument for authoritarian control in the classroom and later on in society. The practice of science in a context that does not permit equality or open questioning can potentially lead students into imbibing values that are antithetical to science. And not just the character of what is taught, but the volume of content too is affected by the methods of teaching. For some time now, a favorite theme among curriculum developers in India has been the load or volume of content described in the syllabus for each grade level. Despite the acknowledgement by the highest body of educational research, namely the NCERT, that the load has become excessive, no solution by way of actually cutting down the load has been pursued. The content to be covered has become absurdly heavy in all school subjects. The textbooks give a reliable glimpse of this situation. Let us look, for example, at the grade 6 history text prepared under the auspices of the NCERT. It covers Alexander, Chandragupta Maurya, Bindusara, and Ashoka in one paragraph each. If we look more closely, we will appreciate the teacher's predicament when she tries to explain a sentence such as this to 11-year-olds. Alexander had invaded India because some of the northern areas were included in the great Persian Empire of the Achaemenid rulers. Who were the Achaemenid rulers? Where was the Persian Empire? What did it mean to include some areas of India in that empire? No teacher has the time to answer such questions, let alone the time to allow children to explore them in the library if there is one. No solution is likely to be found for the problem of curriculum load until it is diagnosed correctly. The problem of volume of content at any grade level does not originate in the so-called explosion of knowledge, which is frequently referred to in our country in discussions of curriculum. It originates in the archaic notion of curriculum as a bag of facts and in the equally archaic view of teaching as a successful delivery of known facts. Unless we shed these notions and accept more modern humanist concepts of curriculum and teaching, we are going to remain stuck as teachers with impossibly large syllabi and fact textbooks to cover. The quasi-bureaucratic organizations responsible for curriculum planning in our country will go on packing the syllabi tighter and tighter, all the time seeking justification in the explosion of knowledge with which our backward country will have to cope. This process of mistaken action and legitimation of action can stop only if we recognize that curriculum planning involves a selection of knowledge and teaching involves the process of creating a classroom ethos in which children want to pursue inquiry. We hardly need to add that a curriculum based on this view of teaching can be prepared and implemented only after the teacher's right to participate in the organization of knowledge and the child's right to autonomy in learning are accepted. Do share your thoughts on Professor Krishna Kumar's views on the problem of curriculum and the challenges in deciding what is worth teaching. You may put them in the comment section below. But meanwhile, here are TTF's takeaways. 3 points and 2 questions. The first point. The ideas shared here are particularly relevant for us today, while India is poised for a new national curriculum framework that may come out in 2023. Point 2. Considering the 2 routes to curriculum development is a comprehensive way of planning for a curriculum framework, the learner's viewpoint versus the value of knowledge. Point 3. NEP 2020 talks about the importance of the development of specific skills in young people, like critical thinking, creative thinking, collaboration, etc. However, how these skills are learnt depends so much on the curricular content that they need to engage with. Question 1. Once a broad curricular framework is provided, can we make it possible for teachers to decide locally the content they could choose to develop the aspired for skills? Another question. How can we build every teacher's capacity to make courageous, thoughtful and relevant decisions while choosing curricular content?